Hello everyone! Today we'll be making this mermaid keychain using polymer clay and resin. I'll also be showing you how to make your own silicone molds for resin pieces. It's day 10 of Mermay and I am still on a roll. I haven't run out of art mediums yet. If you saw my first Mermay video this month, you already know that for this year's challenge, I'm going to attempt to create 31 mermaids using 31 different types of art medium. In this video, I will be covering 2 days worth of art mediums, so if you are also following me on Instagram, you'll get to see this 2 days in a row. Hehe. Let's get started, shall we? I start out with some Sculpey brand polymer clay. Any oven-baked polymer clay will work just as well for this project. I also chose to sculpt it using white clay, which I then painted over later, but I could have easily used different colored clays to make each piece. I just didn't know what colors I wanted everything to be yet, and another thing I'll get to later. I pinched off pieces for the head, body, arms, and fins of the mermaid, and then I proceeded to roll the head into a smooth round ball, and then add a little bitty button nose. It's so cute! I then took some small glass beads and pressed them into the head to make the eyes. You can use pre-baked pieces of polymer clay for this, but I had these beads handy, so I decided to use them. I then take the piece for the body and I roll it into a ball, and then I start rolling it out into a cylinder, making sure that I taper both ends. One end, which will be the tail, I taper a little bit more than the other end, which will be the neck. I also make it a little bit longer too, so that she has a longer tail than torso. I bent the tail a little bit to give it some movement, and then I made an indent in the top where the neck will be, making sure that the flat part is on the front and back, so that this will form the shoulders for her arms to attach to. And since I am notorious for knocking the heads off of my polymer clay figures, I use a small wire to attach the head to the body. This will make it much more secure. I then bake the body at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for about 15 minutes. Now it's time to make the tail. I take both of my pieces for the fins and I roll them into balls, and then I taper them on both ends just like I did the body, more on one end than the other. I then flatten the piece and then shape it a little bit further so it's almost flat on the top. I then proceed to do the same to the second piece. Once I have both my fins, I put them together to look like a little mustache, and then I press the tail piece into the fins. This works well because the body piece is already baked. Once the fins are securely attached and I have them shaped the way I want them, I peel the piece up and I begin making a smooth transition from the fins to the tail. Now the arms, they're really easy. All you have to do is roll them into little cylinders. I try to make one end fatter than the other, but if you like long noodle arms, you can just make them long noodles. After I make my arms, I just smooth them into the shoulders that I've already created. I'm using a small silicone shaper tool here to make all of the transitions smooth. Now for the hair. There's a lot of different ways to do hair on polymer clay figures, but I decided to go with the simplest way, which is just roll out a sheet of polymer clay and then cut it to the shape you want the hair to be. Now the reason that I did this was kind of the same reason why I decided to go with white polymer clay, was because I intended to use this as a blank to make a mold from to cast a resin piece. It wasn't until after I finished this piece that I realized there was too many details and too many small parts that the resin just wouldn't flow into correctly, so I decided to scrap making her into a resin piece, but I ended up making her little sidekick into a resin piece, so it's all good. I then made her a little belt thing. It's like the little fin that goes around their waist. It could be a belt, it could be a fin. The Little Mermaid has one, I don't know. Anyways, whatever it is, I made one for her. And for her little clamshell top, I didn't feel like sculpting them, so I'm using these little nail art pieces to give her some embellishments and clothes. And after this was done, I decided she needed a friend, so I made a mermaid. or a cat mermaid. I just made a mermaid on a smaller scale and gave it ears instead of hair. Then I baked them both at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes. Now it's time to make a mold of our little cat friend. I'm using Smooth-On's Umu 25 silicone rubber compound. And for this you will also need a hot glue gun and plastic cups, not only for making the mold in, but for mixing your mold rubber. I cut the cup down just because it's a little easier to get my hand in there. And then I take my hot glue gun and I decide where I want the spout to be, where my resin will be poured in at. The thing I take into consideration is that every part of the mold needs to be filled by pouring into this one spout. So it essentially all needs to be downhill. You kind of see what I'm saying? Like if I had put the spout on the head, not only would the ears have a hard time filling in with resin, so would the bottom tail piece. Now it's time to mix up our silicone rubber. It is a 1-to-1 ratio, so you'll pour equal parts of the blue part and equal parts of the green part. It's not like resin. It doesn't have like resin and hardener, so it just calls it A part and B part, so I don't know. The thing I like about this mold maker is that it is degassing, which means that it gets the air bubbles out of itself without you having to put it in a pressure pot. This means that you can stir it very vigorously and not really worry about your air bubbles. But just to make sure that it doesn't trap any air bubbles while I'm pouring it, I make sure to start to the side of the piece instead of pouring directly over top of my piece. It also cures in like 75 minutes, something like that, a little bit over an hour. So it doesn't really take long to make a mold at all. You don't have to wait overnight. And once it was cured, I used an X-Acto knife to cut it out. I know what you're thinking. Gasp! She's cutting into that new mold she just made. But essentially what I am doing is creating a 2-part mold. But I only cut down just far enough to get the piece out. That way there is still a substantial piece of rubber at the bottom that is not cut that will hold this mold together. And as you can see, it is rare that a polymer clay blank makes it through the mold making process. Now we're ready to pour some resin. I'm using Envirotex Light Pour On, which is normally used to coat furniture, but I actually really prefer this as a casting resin. It is a 1-to-1 ratio by volume, just like the mold maker. You pour the same amount of resin as you do hardener, and then you mix them together. The only disadvantage is this resin is not degassing. I don't know a resin that is, so you will need a heat gun to pop the bubbles. Once my resin is thoroughly mixed, I am going to color it using alcohol ink. This is one of my favorite methods for coloring resin because it in general does not inhibit the cure like some water-based dyes would. Oh, here's that heat gun I was talking about. I give it a couple blasts with the heat gun to pop some of the bubbles, and then I decided I wanted it to be glittery, so I grabbed me some glitters. Give it a final stir, and now we are ready to pour. I kind of pry the mold open to make sure that the resin gets all the way to the bottom and that there are no air bubbles trapped in there. I then use a rubber band to keep the mold secure and wait for it to cure. Usually about 9 hours, sometimes I just leave it overnight. Once it's cured, it's time to pry that little fella out of there. The first cast was pretty good. I noticed a few air bubbles here and there, but for the most part, he's complete. I used an X-Acto knife to clean up the seams and to cut off the little area where the spout was. And now that he's all done, it's time to move on to our mermaid. I decided to paint her using acrylic craft paint. It tends to go on smoother and have a more matte finish than regular artist acrylic paint. But you will need to build it up using a lot of thin layers. I am so proud of the gradient on her tail, y'all have no idea. Now the hair was a pain to paint. There was a lot of places on the underside that were really hard to get to, and I kept accidentally painting the skin. So I'm glad I decided to paint the hair before I painted the skin. Oh, and another thing about using the glass beads for eyes, if you get paint on them, like I did, you can just scratch it off later when it's dry. Pro tip, art hack! I wanted to add some glitter to her tail, but I didn't want to put a glaze on her, so I decided to use some Pearl-Ex powder. It tends to stick to most surfaces pretty well. It may wear off after some time, so if you're concerned about this, you can spray it with a clear acrylic sealer. Just do a test to make sure it doesn't react with the polymer clay. Now that both our pieces are done, we are ready to turn this into a keychain. I'm going to take these little screw eyes and put them in the top of both the little mermaid and the mermaid. Since the mermaid was polymer clay, I was a little concerned about the screw eye popping out, so I just used a little bit of craft glue to glue it in place and make it a little more secure. Then I just take some head pins and I turn the pearls and the starfish into little charms. I just string them on the head pins, and then I use my round nose pliers to make rings on the top. Just cut off the excess wire, and then you're ready to use jump rings to attach it to the keychain. Well, we are nearing the end of the video, and whew, was that a lot of information to divulge. I am a little winded, but I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. And if you try one out for yourself, let me know in the comments, or tag me on Instagram. The link is in the description below, along with links to my Facebook page as well, if you want to follow to see all of the mermaids every day, instead of waiting to the end of the month to see all of them. Like and subscribe if you want to see more, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.